Hello and welcome to this new episode of the IEFA Conversation Series. I'm Valerie Hopkins, the Southeast Europe correspondent for the Financial Times, and I have the pleasure today to be with Ms. Helga Maria Schmidt, the Secretary General of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Madam Secretary General, you manage the world's largest security-oriented intergovernmental organization. But some of our viewers may not be aware of what it does and how it operates, despite the important role it plays in global affairs, especially currently with the monitoring mission in Ukraine. Can you give us a brief introduction to the organization and how it works, and also to yourself? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me today. Indeed, the OSCE is unique. It's indeed the world's largest regional security organization. It brings together 57 participating states, as we call them, North America, Central Asia, and Europe. So it's unique in its composition. And it's also unique because it addresses security not only from a political military angle, but it is also very much about environmental security, economic security, and human security. And this is very much a realization of the fact that security challenges are not to be seen isolated. They're very complex, particularly these days. So the approach also has to be multidimensional. Now, you mentioned Ukraine. Indeed, the special monitoring mission in Ukraine is our biggest mission. And it was actually the OSCE, it was the only organization in 2014 that could quickly put up a mission to monitor the ceasefire and also to keep the international community informed about the developments on the ground, particularly relevant now in the light of increased tensions. But they also do good work actually to help and ease the hardship of civilians on both sides of the contact line. But so what I would say is that the OSCE, because we are perceived as an honest broker, we are often doing conflict prevention and also conflict management in situations where others cannot act. For example, in the Transnistria settlement process, the Geneva International discussions, the Minsk Group co-chairs. But I should also mention our other field missions. The monitoring mission is the biggest one, and I think it's probably the most known one. But we have altogether 16 field missions in Southeastern Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and they do fantastic work and support their host countries from everything to fighting corruption, combating the trafficking of human beings. They support host countries in the judicial, the rule of law sector, and often also try to promote regional cooperation like trans-boundary water cooperation. So, and not to forget, of course, our independent institutions, the High Commissioner for National Minority, that is in The Hague, our Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw, and the representative for the freedom of the media that is also here in Vienna.
Thank you so much for that explanation. And I'm wondering, though, we are now more than 1 year into this unprecedented global pandemic, and has that brought any new security challenges to the region that the OSCE covers?
Well, there are lots of challenges that, of course, precede the pandemic. But I would say that the pandemic is a good example of the fact that threats to security and stability are not limited to the traditional political military relations among states. And so the pandemic is a health crisis, but it has a huge impact also on the economy. It could lead to global depression, to social unrest. It's also disproportionately affected women, and democracy has come under pressure, particularly in places where emergency measures have been, I would say, misused to undermine fundamental freedoms. And what is very sad is that almost everywhere we have seen a significant rise in domestic violence. I participated only this week in a OSCE-wide conference we were organizing on counter-terrorism. And it's become very clear that terrorism remains one of the most significant threats to security. But what's happened now with the pandemic is that violent extremist groups, terrorist organizations, they are capitalizing on the vulnerabilities, on the fear, also on the uncertainty that's created by the pandemic to promote hatred, but also violent action. And I think, again, here, the OSCE's approach is so relevant because hard security alone cannot win the day. So we are very much working on prevention, but also on whole of society approaches to use really every opportunity to make sure that, or to promote pathways away from violence. And maybe another example I could give, and that's the trafficking in human beings. This plagues the entire OSCE region, and it's clearly one of the worst human rights violations you can have. But there's also a security angle because of the link to organized crime. And it's a symptom, of course, of structural inequalities, economic inequalities, gender inequalities. And now with COVID has pushed so many, I would say probably millions, into vulnerability, which means that greater risk of exploitation. And again, women, children are disproportionately affected. And so here also the OSCE is doing important work, first of all, on awareness raising, but also prevention, protection. And also we're working very closely in partnership with the private sector. And I would say, and that's an issue very dear to my heart, women's economic empowerment is so important because that makes women a lot less vulnerable. And maybe what I should also mention is we are on the brink of a technological revolution that will affect our entire lives, and is affecting already our entire lives, but it also has an impact on our security. And now, of course, the digitalization of our world has been way underway before the pandemic, but there is no doubt that the pandemic has forced us to embrace technologies in a way that at a lot greater speed, of course, also risking increasing the risks that go hand in hand with that. So, and many new technologies are actually double-edged swords. So they can pose unforeseen threats, particularly when they fall into the wrong hands, in the hands of criminal gangs, terrorist networks. But they can also be beneficial. Look at all the opportunities for law enforcement authorities to share information, timely information across borders. Or we have also been using them in conflict prevention. You mentioned our mission in Ukraine. Our mission was in a position to continue their work, also thanks to the new technologies. And here, I think this is an area where we have to embrace. And here the OSCE is also very active, also in the whole sphere of cyber and cybersecurity, where we have agreed confidence building measures to reduce the risk of conflict, for example, in the cyberspace. So, so our approach has been to actually promote best practices, is not to blame anyone for the shortcomings. I think everyone has been struggling to see how to best cope with the consequences of the pandemic. But we have been promoting best practices. And I would say that really also all our committees, the Secretariat, but also our independent institutions have worked to address the implications for security, be it arms control, be it conflict management, corruption, organized crime. And let me also say that I'm very proud of the excellent work that is done by our OSCE staff, who really have worked so hard and really right from the beginning when the pandemic struck to ensure business continuity.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I imagine it's very difficult to keep a lot of monitors on the ground as a global pandemic breaks out, but they are doing very important work. And you mentioned in your previous answer that we've seen, because of the pandemic, a rise in domestic violence, a rise in financial insecurity issues. And these are also issues that disproportionately seem to affect women. I'm wondering if you can speak about connection between women and security, maybe with a specific focus on economic empowerment and how that relates to security. And as I understand, you are the first female Secretary General of the OSCE. So I'm wondering if that in any way shapes your approach.
No, indeed, I'm the first female Secretary General, but I also have the good chance to have a female chair, Ann Linde, the Swedish Foreign Minister, our chairperson for this year. But women are also leading, for example, our conflict prevention center here. They are managing patrol hubs. They are heading field operations. Not enough. I'm trying and very much encouraging and promoting an increase in numbers. So this is all good. But the fact is that particularly when it comes to peace negotiations, also conflict crisis management situations, the views of women are very often overlooked, let alone allowing them to fully participate in the decision-making sphere. And I absolutely believe that we cannot afford just to ignore 50% of the population, also because there is empiric evidence that, for example, peace agreements where women are not present have a lot higher risk to relapse into conflict. And so there's still so much to do. I think many countries have made commitments to implement Resolution 1325, which is 20 years old, which is actually about ensuring women's participation. But the reality is speaks a very different language. So if you look back in the past 20 years, only like 13% have been negotiators and only 6% have been mediators. And this is, of course, not enough. But you asked, I think, the right question, because I think one of the issues has been the lack of women's economic empowerment. Because if women do not have access to financial assets in their countries, for example, if they don't have access to the economy, it's a lot more difficult for them to actually play a role in the decision-making spheres. So this is why, and this is very much also a priority this year of our Swedish chair, we are trying to, first of all, establish the clear links between women's economic empowerment, security, but also sustainable development. And this will also be the focus of this year's high-level OSCE Economic and Environmental Forum. And we do very concrete work in the OSCE, also not only to work on the policies, but also on the legislative dimensions, because often it's also an issue of the legislation. And so there's a lot, of course, we can do to convince. I think one argument I always use is that actually, if you increase the women's participation and or the rate of women in the economies in OSCE, you could actually boost the aggregated GDP by 15%. So I think there's also a very strong and convincing economic argument to be made.
Wow, you said 15%. 15%
OSCE-wide, I mean, a billion people, 57 countries. But still, I think it's an impressive figure.
That is quite impressive. Wow, so there's 1 billion people, 57 countries in the OSCE, from the Russian Federation to the United States, Mongolia, the Netherlands. You know, at a time right now when we're facing this kind of seeming crisis of multilateralism, with an organization with such a diverse membership, are you able to get things done? You know, how are you able to find a consensus with these 57 countries enough to keep the organization moving and relevant?
Now, first, yes, we have consensus principle, but and this is sometimes difficult, indeed, to find consensus. But also, what I would say, it gives decisions, once they are taking, a lot more legitimacy, because they're really taking at the level of 57, and it gives us joint ownership. But you mentioned multilateralism. I have to say, this is something that where every organization has been affected. There is indeed I would say the whole multilateral order has been undergoing some crisis. we've seen, and this is probably more worrying for me, we see a decline of trust, which is very important in politics, a comeback of power politics, eroding arms control regime, which is, I think, a good example of this loss of trust and confidence. We've also seen a rise in nationalism, xenophobia, intolerance, and something I actually forgot to mention is that as yesterday was Earth Day, is our ecological footprint is very much deteriorating, and climate change and also the loss of biodiversity presents a huge risk when it comes to security, because a lot of the internal state conflicts we still have actually go back or have their roots in a fight over resources. Why I'm saying that? Because to find solutions, and this of course goes back to your questions, I think you need political will and you need cooperation. And here, sometimes I think there is also good to look back a bit at the history of the OSCE, which is quite impressive. And maybe we need a bit of this founding spirit also of the OSCE, because if you look back, it was really in the midst of the Cold War when the leaders, the then leaders, as diverse as they were, sat together and agreed on the Paris Charter in 1990. And this is, I have very fond memories because this was actually the first international event I attended as a very, very young diplomat, not in any important function, of course, in those days. But I always remember that because this was really a moment when you had the feeling that the dialogue, actually cooperation, prevailed over confrontation. And I think it maybe have been a time where you had arguably even greater tensions. So I think, and the great value we have today is with the OSCE, that you have every country around the table. We are all around the table. Yes, we have differences. There are also differences in values, but I think it provides us with a huge opportunity to tackle all these challenges I have been referring to. And again, it's not only our broad membership, it's also the approach we take is not to see threats isolated, but really to see the political, military dimension, economic, environmental, more and more so, but the very important human dimension also as equally important. You need, of course, political will of the participating states. We need their support. We need them to implement the commitments. But I'm absolutely convinced is that the OSCE is the indispensable organization actually that provides the necessary framework to tackle together all these challenges we're facing.
Thank you so much. And if I may just ask one more question, diplomacy has changed and evolved quite a lot since the Helsinki Final Act in the '76, but especially it's been under great strain in the last year. I mean, we saw just recently the environmental summit, you know, even world leaders forgetting to unmute themselves, calling in from all over the world without this personal touch, without this actually sitting around the table, as you mentioned. And as I understand, even, you know, the Russian-Ukrainian negotiations sometimes are going on by Zoom. You know, how do you think this crisis has affected kind of the real difficult tasks of diplomacy, of sitting down together and banging things out?
I would say, I mean, thanks to modern technologies, we were able to continue working, but nothing replaces the personal contact. It's very difficult to do confidence building, trust building, mediation, facilitation via VTC. So for that, you really need the personal contact. And but without VTCs, without the opportunities provided by the new technologies, I think we wouldn't have been able to do anything. And also new technologies have helped us in Ukraine to help our mission to continue to monitor. But I'm very much looking forward also to the moment when we will go at least to hybrid meetings where you can meet some people and not do everything only via the screen. As nice as it is to see you, but it would be nicer to sit and have a coffee together.
I agree. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and to address the forum, and hope we'll have an opportunity to meet in person sometime soon.
Thanks very much for having me.